Well, I'm from Nashville. I work in Murfreesboro, so I've been here all my life. Went through all my education, all of that here in Nashville. So, born, bred, and live in Nashville. My parents brought me here when I was a kid, when the fort was closed. It was an area where a lot of families went to have picnics, even though it was a closed fort. People loved the front area. It looked like a picnic ground. So I remember coming here as a kid. Um, my personal relationship with Fort Negley really developed between one particular person, and his name is Bill Radcliffe. He was the first on the scene here at Fort Negley, dressed in a Union blue uniform on a hill. And then later he was joined by a gentleman named Dennis Boggs, who portrays Abraham Lincoln. And through those two men, I ran into them in the Inglewood Library, 12 years ago. They were speaking about African Americans in the Civil War. I went to that event, and then I've been on their coattails ever since. So that group turned into the 13th United States Colored Troops Living History Association. So we would be stationed here, and I joined that group, and we'd be here, for living history projects. Living history is telling a story, setting a scene where you know exactly how the life was of a soldier. So tents are set up, fires are made. We do drilling, exercises like soldiers would do, because it does mean something to us when we're here on this hill. When my father passed away, he had been working on some documents about the family history, military-wise. That gave me the key to start looking, because you only have names. Census records will help you. For a lot of African Americans, their names were changed. If they were dwelling with a slave master, then they took on the slave master's name. And so some of that history is disputed. That can never be recovered. You can only go and start with a name. And that's what happened with me. My father was from Lebanon, Tennessee, a Korean War veteran. His father and my grandfather fought in World War I, going all the way back to the Civil War. And finding one of those War Department documents, it had on the back side, grandmother receiving pension from the Civil War. And so as I went up that family tree, I found the Bailey family. And in that, I found through our Sons of Union Veterans group, they will do lineages for you. And they trace that Peter Bailey was a part of that family. So I'd been a reenactor for 6 years before I knew that my blood DNA not only was with the Civil War and the Battle of Nashville, but I learned 2 years ago that that same soldier was here at Fort Negley in 1865. And the ironic twist to it is that Peter Bailey signed up for the Union Army in Murfreesboro, Tennessee on January 6th. I started my job with General Mills in Murfreesboro on January 6th. Same date, same city, different year. That's that full circle connection. It was a very emotional part of that collection of memories, because I was already fighting a battle against ignorance about African Americans who served in the Civil War. And then to find out my own flesh and blood did it was gratifying. You gain more ownership knowing that you had an ancestor here. It gives you a more sense of pride. You already honor those who were here, but to know that someone who looked possibly like you was here before you gives you another sense of really remembering the legacy and ensuring that others know that legacy as well. With Fort Negley being the largest hidden fort in America, is very important to Civil War history. There are two other areas. One is called Granbury's Lunette, which is about 5 miles north away from here, right off of Murfreesboro Pike. Was a conflict that happened on December 15th. The Battle of Nashville was December 15th and 16th. My great-great-grandfather, Private Peter Bailey, fought in both of those engagements. So on the 15th, at Granbury's Lunette, on the 16th at Peach Orchard Hill, which is now Travelers Rest Plantation Home. My great-great-grandfather's DNA is on those battle sites. When the black man first got in the Civil War, they were used mostly for labor. So they built railroads. So I went to Johnsonville, Tennessee, where African Americans fought in a conflict there. and I found this railroad spike that I've kept now for 6 years. This piece of cured metal is significant in so many different ways. It displays strength in its nature, and the head of this particular spike took pounds from some man to knock it into the ground. So it always reminds me of their labor. It still stands tall, just like our legacy as African Americans in this United States, but also reminds me of the strength that they once had, the power of that struggle, and it's still a struggle today.
Fort Negley. You were built by the hands of the oppressed and some men free. Your craftsmanship remains for future generations to see. Your foundation was built with stone, wood, and railroad steel as you majestically sit upon St. Cloud Hill.
That poem, those words that were written, give me that foundation about what Fort Negley really is. For Nashville, for some in the history, it's an eyesore. It's a Union fort in a southern city during the Civil War. And so for a lot of people here, it was an embarrassment because it was a Union fort, because the Union Army occupied Nashville in 1862. So that was an embarrassment at that time. The Civil War is one of those subjects, we still talk about it, obviously, today, 154 years later, we talk about the Civil War. So in that, just the opportunity of Nashville embracing that legacy, even though it might not be the total Southern heritage, is a part of our American heritage. It's all a part of the landscape of Nashville. It has nothing to do with blue or gray. It's about red blood, people of just one accord. Well, I do remember these significant times of our past. But Fort Negley was the one that rested on my heart more than anything, because their story once again wasn't told. And to know that men, women, and children labored here, and some died during that opportunity. That the Union Army wasn't also the black man's best friend. They went into churches and homes and what they call conscripted labor. They just basically forced them to work on this fortification. Like I said, in that 6-month period, so you're talking about from extreme heat to extreme cold. Estimated 600, 800 died building that fort. So somebody has to speak for them, and I'm one of those of many. It is our duty to pass that on, not only to our families, but to future generations. Most of those living histories we talked about earlier involve people who come here, young people especially. We love showing them how to march, showing them how a soldier would live. Because you plant that seed, it might not grow in all of them, but it's going to get into one of them. And that's what happened to me as a child growing up in Nashville. I went to the Hermitage, didn't really know a connection of it in slavery. But something about going to that historical site put some fire in me, and I didn't know what to do with it. And then that seed developed into a seed planted here, and now it's grown in me. And now I'm here to be one of those advocates for Fort Negley. It's my duty, it's my legacy. Ironically, I go to church in the Hermitage area, and many mornings before I go to church, I go to the Hermitage. I stand behind the gate that has a vast amount of land, and I think about what my ancestors would be doing on a Sunday morning. Would they be working before having the opportunity to go to church? Because some slaves would. And it centers me once again to know exactly where I've come from, no matter what happens today. Somebody yesterday prayed that I would have a better life, that we would have a better life. And so that has occurred. Obviously, when you think about American history and the institution of slavery, that is one aspect of our history that everybody knows. But what a lot of people don't know is what came out of that. That even out of that degradation was a sense of pride. Those laborers who built this fort, of my skin color, of my complexion, they weren't given the dignity of having some dwellings to live. Some of them died of disease, some of them died of overexposure. So one generation paid the price. This generation of the Civil War paid the price, and now we're the dividends of that, the recipients. So knowing that history that's contained here, I have an obligation to tell others about it.
Once a Union stronghold standing tall and bold, through countless decades your remains became tattered and old. The sounds of the bugle rally the troops no more, but just the echoes of a divided past we must not ignore.
I went to the Tennessee Library and Archives, and they had a vast folder on Fort Negley, and I was surprised at how much they remembered Fort Negley. There was a Fort Negley dry cleaners. There were many things named after Fort Negley in this neighborhood that I had no clue in doing that research. So at one point, Fort Negley name was very significant. And I even found when they installed the front walls, that's one of the facades about the fort. The walls you see in the front were not here during the Civil War. They were put up in the 1930s by the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, after the New Deal. The kind of tombstone-ish stone that's underneath the flagpole out on the grounds, that was put up by the WPA. And that's another misconception about the fort. Many of the foundation is still original, but most of it is a rebuild from the WPA. Even back then, they want to restore the fort.
There is a rebirth in you now, the ages to see, handed down from our ancestors, their legacy to be. You're in our hands now, a task certainly not forsaken. For the city of Nashville, we all have gallantly taken. You fortify our thoughts in your new beginning, leaving your mark for the future to see. Once a mighty fortress in the heart of our city, a place called Fort Negley.
It's a spiritual connection that you can't describe. It's something you feel. And as the American flags outside represent those 2,771 laborers who are here, who worked here, for me to know that my DNA is linked here, that other men fought so I wouldn't have to, touches the core of my heart. To know that in my family there were brave men who fought for the United States, and they made sure that my legacy was secure, that I could live in a safe country and be proud of the color of my skin and what I represent just as a man. To get something to commemorate him serving, he was 5'8", 18 years old when he entered the Civil War, fought in 2 engagements, lived through terrible conditions, ended up buried in Lincoln Cemetery in Chicago, Illinois, where I went to his grave 2 years ago and put a Sons of Union veteran marker on his grave. He laid in his grave for over 150 years with no marker. Nobody knew he was there. If it wasn't for the great records of the cemetery, I never would have found him. So I'm glad he's honored today, like the other veterans should be. So.
Oh, freedom over me, and before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
I would say it's God's decree that I have this opportunity to speak for others who have a voice no longer heard. Their remains are on these grounds. They're sleeping, waiting for somebody to tell their story. So we're here.
And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my